Thank you so much, Professor Singh and the rest of the organising committee for hosting me here. It's a great honour to be presenting this. And one way to look at the paper I'm going to be giving today is it's a rather long-winded way of explaining why I've come all the way to India to discuss this with you. So what I'm going to present is a conceptual paper that is early in a new phase of work, but it's one that builds on a lot of empirical research that I've done previously. I'm not going to be presenting that work directly. It concerns conditions of precarious work and precarious lives with a particular focus on Britain. But I'm very happy to send a PDF for the book where I report on that and some other reports to anyone who would like. But today I'm going to be talking about some conceptualization that is developing out of that work to point the direction for the next phases in the research. And I'd really welcome people's engagement and feedback in this. Essentially, I'm going to be making a Western rationalist case, drawing on the Marxist tradition, for a more holistic way of being as a way out of the environmental and social crisis that Western capitalism has created. So I'm going to be moving through a series of stages in this paper. Firstly, I'll briefly present the problem, which I would sum up as precarity escalating, well, to extinction, ongoing extinction of other species in many cases, and towards possibility extinction of humanity itself. Then I'll move to interrogating the problem, and which I would argue is fundamentally about a process of alienation, an alienation from ourselves, from society, and from the rest of nature. Then I'll make an argument for a precondition for a solution, which is to recognize the full self, which I argue as part of Western capitalism has been denied. And then I'll talk about where I'm proposing to go geographically and socially in search of a solution, and ideas of relearning things that in Western capitalism have been forgotten. So to begin, and to just sum up some of the conditions of precarity that I'm talking about, this is a cartoon from the Guardian newspaper which sums up one very important aspect, and Amazon warehouse work is characteristic of the work experienced by growing numbers of people in Britain. And what the cartoon points to is the quest for perpetual existence through private accumulation, which I argue is a break from the kind of natural rhythms and is actually imperiling our ongoing survival as a species by breaking from those natural rhythms. I'm going to draw attention now to what I argue is some key characteristics of these conditions of work which are important to sum this up. This is a vignette, so it's a fictional vignette which I produced to draw attention to some key trends which, from a review of more than 500 sources about conditions in Amazon warehouses, we identified. Jack bends to pick up the next item from the container, not having time to stop and enjoy the brief warmth on his skin as his hand passes through a sunbeam from the warehouse windows high above. As he straightens, he feels a familiar twinge in his lower back. But today is a good day. Today, the queue for the sandwich machine was short, so he managed to fit in a trip to the toilet within the 30 minutes allowed, along with the 10-minute walk each way to and from the canteen. He had to eat it on the hoof while walking back to his station, and the slimy plastic-wrapped tuna sandwich wasn't the best meal he'd ever had, but he's had worse. He checks the item against the digital display installed on his station. Silk shirt, blue, next day delivery. It will probably be in landfill by the end of the month. The shirt sparks a memory of Emma, how much he'd enjoyed dressing up for her when they first met, and her deft hands in undoing his buttons. The beep of the digital display pulls him back to the present, also bringing the attention of his supervisor, who raises her voice over the clang and rattle of the warehouse floor. "You all right there? Need to remind me of your target?" All fine, no problem. Jack flashes a forced grin, feeling in the pit of his stomach the familiar worry that he might fall into the bottom 10% and be dismissed. He wishes he could talk to his co-workers about it, but he barely knows them, and the supervisors frown on conversation as a distraction. Anyway, none of them know where their performance ranks against the others until the end of the month, and by then, if they're at the bottom, it's already too late. So he pushes himself faster, looking forward only to the end of his shift. Jack badly needs the money, saving it to get a place back home big enough for Emma and him to start a family. That's the idea, anyway. Later, as he lies in bed, scratching the bug bites and aching from the overtime he's taken on at the expense of his evening video call with Emma, that dream will feel increasingly distant. Now that illustrates some of the conditions of precarity and the alienation that I argue underpins that precarity. And it's an alienation that is fundamentally about people being denied control over their own movements because they're alienated from their environment in the forms of the things that they need to live. So this, drawing on that classical Marxist analysis, means that all that people have in order to sell, to get the things they need to live, is their ability to work, their labor power. And so that alienation from control over oneself and that alienation from control over one's environment are fundamentally linked within capitalism. And it leads to this lack of control over one's movement. It's an alienation from control over one's body. And I argue that this can also help to explain how capitalism has brought such environmental destruction through that alienation from our environment and through a relationship to the environment which seeks to relate through domination as opposed to cooperation and as opposed to a holistic approach. To quote Marx, and I would argue that Marx is a thinker who more than 150 years ago was dealing with ecological questions and the relationship with work and with humanity, said, man is directly a natural being. As a natural being and as a living natural being, he is on the one hand endowed with natural powers and faculties which exist in him as tendencies and abilities as drives. So these needs of human beings, our needs as biological human beings, are a fundamental tether to the rest of nature. Marx continues, on the other hand, as a natural embodied sentient objective being, he is a suffering, conditioned and limited being, like animals and plants. The objects of his lives exist outside himself as objects independent of him, and yet they are objects of his needs, essential objects which are indispensable to the exercise and confirmation of his faculties. And I argue, drawing on that labor, in the sense of our interaction with the world around us, is central to our sense of ourself, because it's through interacting with things that are not ourself that we experience the limits and we come to know who I am. It's something that drives our cooperation and our community with other people. People like John Bellamy Foster have argued that it was central, that cooperation to meet our needs was central to the development of human language. And it's central to our relationship to the environment because our needs push us to go out and interact with that world. And it's a dynamic process because as we interact with that world, that creates a blurring of the boundaries of ourselves. At the same time we experience ourselves, to the extent we can influence the rest of nature, then we are putting ourselves out into the world as well as taking parts of the rest of the world into us. McCarthy argues then that to focus on human needs enables us to strike at the heart of the labor-nature relation and to help direct action in order to try and repair some of that separation, that alienation that has been produced by Western capitalism. To unpack this a bit further, I think it's important to consider what is this self that is alienated. And I think thinking about this can help to understand how this has happened under Western capitalism and draw some useful comparisons to other forms of society that might help us to get out of this situation that we're in. So we are, of course, we are physical, we are embodied, and those bodies in motion constitute work, but we're also more than just a simple sack of meat. We are, of course, a mind as well, and we're rational. But often within Western capitalist thought, that's as far as it goes. That's as much of the human being as is acknowledged. But we also have what, in many societies, various forms of this kind of conceptualization, that we also have some other part of us that we feel deeply, but that can often be difficult to put into words. That part of us that has been variously defined as feeling or emotion, as spirit. And so to understand fully this process of alienation and how that might be repaired, I argue that it's important to consider all of these different parts, the way that alienation operates within each of these dimensions of ourselves. And also to think about practices which exist in many different human societies and have independently developed in many societies around the world that connect these different dimensions and that enable things to be known in ways that aren't purely rational and transmitted. So I'm thinking here about things like dance that connect the body and feeling. I'm thinking about things like story, which can be understood as connecting feelings and the mind. And that's an area I want to explore about the potential for those to represent important areas for intervention, which might not be immediately relevant to things like our relationship to our relationship to the environment or the way that we practice our work. So, to think about how, if we understand these conditions of alienation from the self, from other humans, and from the rest of nature as interlinked, and these interacting fundamentally through the way that we move in our work, our interactions with the world, but that also connecting with the way that we move in other parts of our life, then we can think about moving from the kind of situation I described in that vignette earlier, which I would describe as precarity. And I really like the concept of precarity because it has a bodily, figurative character to it, that it's more than simply saying people are on temporary contracts or people are doing informal work. It conveys a sense of being off balance and therefore finding it difficult to control where you might move. And so there's an alternative to that. We might think about dancing together to express figuratively a way of moving together in a way that is dynamic and where we exercise agency together. And dancing together in the sense of laboring and living in a way that is ecological might call for regulation informed by scientific ecological analysis, and this is something that Engels argued in the use of science to predict indirect and indirect kind of consequences of our actions beyond what is obvious. But it might also call for other kinds of knowledge. So if we have this focus on meaningful connection that arises from the concrete labor involved in the production to meet our needs, then this gives the particular local environment great importance and calls for us to be attentive to the ways that locality-specific knowledge of nature can be embedded in cultural practices and passed on, but in ways which have been systematically ignored and delegitimized under Western capitalist thought. So, for example, various practices of tribal peoples, for example. And there are a lot of examples. Obviously, the kind of argument I'm making, the way to live, there are many examples of this in human history and in society today that I think we, living in Western capitalist countries, need to learn a lot from. So just as an example that I learned about another conference in Calcutta just last week, Faridi is documenting the example of the Bakwal tribe of Jammu and Kashmir, a pastoral people whose mobile labor across the land is benefiting the entire ecosystem, as well as meeting their needs in a sustainable way. And we can talk about many more examples as well, and there have been some talked about in this conference as well. And it is important not to romanticize these examples or to underestimate the challenges of learning from those in a way that can translate insights to a radically different context, like Britain. But they may still offer a crucial guide to the way out, and in a situation where the solutions to the problems that we face may not be found within the problem itself. As a previous conference I was at last week of the Kolkata Research Group, Professor Ranabir Samada powerfully argued. So I will stop there and really welcome all kind of contributions and thoughts, and I've already learned so much in discussion with all of you this week. Thank you very much for your time.